Now, I don't know much about heroes, but I know that whatever you call them, there is someone. Someone who'll never give up trying to do the right thing, no matter what. There's no prophecy or legend about anyone like that. It's just something I know is true. Hello, everyone. My name is Fax. The lines you just heard are spoken by Gerson to Susie during the Hammer of Justice battle. When I first saw this scene, I was extremely shocked. My mind started racing. Back in the time of chapters 1 and 2, I had already thought about many theories that lacked solid evidence. But after these lines appeared, my theory finally began to take shape. Then, on top of that, people discovered that the chapters of Deltarune correspond to locations in Undertale, which made me even more certain that this theory truly exists. First, I need to explain why Gerson's words struck me so deeply, because he said something very similar in Undertale. I am not a hero, but I know there's someone out there. Someone who will never give up trying to do the right thing, no matter what. There's no prophecy or legend about anyone like that. It's just something I know is true, that someone like that will strike you down. These lines come from the genocide route, during Gerson's shop dialogue in Waterfall, where he is describing Undyne. But in Deltarune, the one who insists on doing the right thing is no longer Undyne, it becomes Susie instead. The reason this shocked me so much is because in Undertale's genocide route, Undyne the Undying ultimately fails. The protagonist we control still crosses that line and moves forward in the story. But Deltarune is different. First of all, it's very clear that Susie's narrative role is not simple at all. In fact, in terms of storytelling, she even carries a stronger protagonist presence than Chris. And from what Gerson says to Susie in chapter 4, it's very obvious that he's hinting that Susie is the key to breaking the prophecy in the future, and I believe that as well. So what does that mean? In Undertale, Undyne, who was also singled out by Gerson, ultimately failed to change the prophecy and failed to stop the genocide route protagonist. But in Deltarune, Susie has a very high chance of breaking the prophecy in the future. Are you starting to understand what I'm trying to say? In short, Deltarune is, to a certain extent, the opposite of Undertale in terms of story and setting. And this is even reflected in the capitalization of their titles. Once you start examining the game from this angle, you'll discover more and more connections that echo each other. Later on, the even more astonishing part came up as I mentioned earlier. People discovered that Deltarune's chapters correspond to Undertale's locations. What's interesting is that the order of Undertale's locations is actually reversed. How so? I'll list each comparison one by one, and it'll become clear. Oh, one more thing, although I'm saying locations, what I'm really referring to is the main story that takes place in those locations. The locations themselves are just a rough boundary. You'll understand why I say this once we go into detail. Alright, let's continue. First, Deltarune, Chapter 1. The Card Kingdom corresponds to Undertale's new home. Both feature royal castle, style architecture, a king-like boss battle, goat-like characters appearing, and a sequence where you return to visit friends. Deltarune, Chapter 2. The Cyber World corresponds to Undertale's core. Both feature high-tech environments, robot bosses, or a Neoform boss fight. Deltarune, Chapter 3. The TV World corresponds to Undertale's Hotland. Both involve TV show-style stages, a Tsundere-like NPC, and a TV-headed boss. Deltarune, Chapter 4, The Dark Sanctuary, corresponds to Undertale's Waterfall. Both have shoreline scenery, prophecy walls, piano puzzles, ghost-themed music, and a boss battle involving a weapon of justice. From these similarities, we can clearly see that Deltarune and Undertale do share a certain level of connection in their setting design. But there's also something very strange. The secret boss of Deltarune Chapter 2, Spamton Neo, uses the yellow shooting mode, which corresponds to Mettaton's yellow shooting mode in Undertale's core. And the secret boss of Chapter 4, the Hammer of Justice battle, uses the green blocking mode, which corresponds to Undyne's green blocking mode in Undertale's Waterfall. Both of these chapters match perfectly. So, Why is it that Deltarune Chapter 3 secret boss fights, whether it's Erem or the Roaring Knight, do not correspond to Muffet's purple trap mode in Hotland? This question troubled me for a very long time. It wasn't until I developed my soul trait theory, where I concluded that Chapter 3 represents the Orange Soul, that everything suddenly clicked. When I looked into information about the Orange Soul, I realized that because it doesn't have a special battle mode, the only thing to examine was orange attacks. And once I checked, I discovered that the earliest appearance of orange attacks in Undertale is in Hotland. That's why Chapter 3's secret boss does not use the purple special mode. If we're trying to assign all 7 soul traits across 7 chapters, then the theme of bravery fits Chapter 3 the best. So, how should the purple soul be assigned? In Undertale, purple soul mode belongs to Muffet, and Muffet fights the protagonist mainly over spider rights, and the conflict is ultimately resolved when the spiders in the ruins send a telegram. So, Deltarune's purple soul chapter will most likely correspond to the ruins. The ruins color scheme is also purple, which fits perfectly with the purple soul. Following the same logic, the first appearance of light blue attacks in Undertale is in Snowdin Forest, and Snowdin is the location of Papyrus's blue gravity battle. Based on all this, we can infer that Deltarune chapters 5, 6, and 7 will correspond to the blue, light blue, and purple soul traits, mapping to Undertale's Snowdin, Snowdin Forest, and ruins respectively. Earlier, we saw the idea that Deltarune is the inverse of Undertale, through setting design and soul traits. So, now the question is, can we find similar connections in the story itself? When it comes to story, I want to bring up something very interesting. Do you remember Everyman? He first appeared in Undertale as part of the Amalgamate Reaper Bird's attack animation. And in Deltarune chapters 1 and 2, he also appears in some attack animations. Back in chapter 2, I thought Everyman would be a recurring Easter egg. I even planned to make a compilation after all the chapters were released. But then, he completely disappeared in chapters 3 and 4. I was very confused about this, so I thought back to the idea that Deltarune is the inverse of Undertale. I started wondering, could it be that Everyman only appears in chapters 1 and 2 because of Undertale? What if Everyman represents the Amalgamates? Before going further, let me ask you something. From a story perspective, do you think Undertale's True Lab belongs to Hotland or to the core? Pay attention, I mean in terms of story. It's true that you can only access the True Lab after completing a neutral route, but players who start with a pacifist route might not know this. If you killed any monsters in your first run, you can't simply reload your save and get Undyne's letter. You have to start a second playthrough and go pacifist from the beginning. And at that point, after you finish the fight with Mettaton and listen to Alphys talk, you can immediately go back and trigger the letter event with Undyne. And after completing the True Lab, the elevator takes you directly to New Home. All of this proves that, narratively speaking, the True Lab belongs to the core. With that established, let's go back to Everyman. In Undertale, Everyman is only part of Reaper Bird's attack animation. But if we treat Everyman as a symbol of the Amalgamates, things start to make sense. The Amalgamates only appear in the True Lab and during the Return to Visit Friends sequence. As mentioned earlier, both Deltarune Chapter 1 and Undertale's final section include a Return to Visit Friends. So, under this correspondence, the Amalgamates also belong to New Home. And since the True Lab belongs to the core, that explains why Everyman only appears in Deltarune Chapters 1 and 2. So why am I talking about Everyman? Because by using Everyman to connect Undertale's True Lab to the core, it also indirectly links to Deltarune Chapter 2. So what happens in Deltarune Chapter 2 that carries the same narrative weight as the True Lab? The moment I realized it, I got full body chills. Isn't it the weird route? If Deltarune Chapter 2's weird route corresponds to Undertale's core and the True Lab, then what does Deltarune Chapter 4's weird route correspond to in Undertale's waterfall? To answer that, we need to think about what the True Lab represents in Undertale's story. After the date with Alphys, we learn that she only decided to deal with the True Lab because she was encouraged by her friends, and the protagonist must then go there. And if you complete a neutral route after dating Alphys, Flowey even tells you to go check out Alphys' lab, saying that your date with her has only just begun. This means that the True Lab is part of the process of befriending Alphys. The date is only the first half of becoming her friend, and that's when I finally understood it. The weird route in Deltarune corresponds to Undertale's friendship arcs, which are part of the pacifist route. Undertale has 3 friendship arcs: Papyrus, Undyne, and Alphys. They take place in Snowdin, Waterfall, and the Core. These correspond to Deltarune chapters 5, 4, and 2. And the chapters where the weird route currently requires player input to continue are chapter 2 and chapter 4. Judging from chapter 4's ending, chapter 5 will very clearly have a weird route as well. So I'll make a bold conclusion. Undertale's pacifist route corresponds to Deltarune's weird route. The weird route is about befriending Noelle. Oh my god. Right? Now it really feels like Deltarune is the inverse of Undertale. And since Undertale doesn't have any other friendship arcs, I suspect that after chapter 5 ends, there will no longer be any variables that can change the weird route. That covers my main arguments. Now I want to share 2 predictions about the future story, both derived from this theory. First, my prediction for chapter 5. Earlier, I mentioned that chapter 5 will likely share traits with Undertale's Snowdin. Let's list some of those traits: snow, festivals, houses, Christmas tree, gifts, and a bar. So, is there a place in the light world that contains all of these elements? There is, and I think many of you already guessed it. Noelle's house. The air conditioning in Noelle's house is always set very low. In chapter 3, just opening the door slightly and letting wind in was enough to turn the final area into an extreme cold environment. So it's perfectly reasonable that Noelle's house could produce a snowy, dark world. Noelle's house also has clear Christmas elements, which match Snowdin's festive atmosphere. There's a painting in the kitchen showing many houses, which could materialize into multiple buildings in the dark world, just like the Ferris wheel in chapter 2. The Christmas tree next to the piano also strongly resembles the tree in Snowdin's town square. As for gifts, Noelle's house literally has an entire room filled with gift boxes. And for the bar, I'm reminded of Chris making custom drinks in chapter 4. I mean, doesn't everything line up? It's pretty unbelievable, right? Even though the light world and dark world are separate things, I think the probability of this correspondence is much higher than any other location. And considering the direction of chapter 4's story, I don't think this is impossible at all. Think about it. At the end of chapter 4, Susie is clearly troubled by the final prophecy. Because of that, during the festival in chapter 5's morning, she might not be able to enjoy herself, and decides to return to Noelle's house to retrieve the code she didn't finish reading the day before. Asgore could also be there, since he currently works as a helper for Noelle's family and cooperates with Carol. It wouldn't be strange for him to enter Noelle's house to retrieve something. Then, someone we don't know who opens the dark fountain in Noelle's house, pulling these characters into the dark world. During the dark world adventure, Susie gets to properly talk things through about the prophecy, clears things up, and makes promises or plans with the others. She then leaves the dark world feeling reassured. When they come back out, it could be afternoon or evening. Maybe the festival isn't over yet, allowing her to finally enjoy the celebration with her friends. Then the story hints at a new incident or crisis, leaving players in suspense. That's my reasoning for why the Noelle's house scenario is plausible. As for Gerson's description of chapter 5 and the Flower Man's prophecy, all I can say is that this theory only helps me narrow down the most likely location of chapter 5's dark world. The specific plot details are beyond what this theory can predict. Honestly, I even suspect that Toby is intentionally guiding players to focus their expectations around Asgore, making us overlook other possibilities, so that when the outcome turns out differently, we'll feel like we've been played again, just like all the theories surrounding chapter 3 back then. But this time, I'm placing my bet on a location that no one expected yet is still connected and reasonable. Finally, my second prediction under this theory is about the prophecy. Based on my previous plant darkener theory, I believe Ralsei is a flower. In Undertale's pacifist ending, Flowey transforms from a flower into a goat monster. He originally planned to play endlessly with the protagonist, but after being persuaded, he gives up, his plan fails, he helps break the barrier, returns all the souls, loses his power, and turns back into a flower. If Deltarune is the inverse of Undertale, then doesn't that mean Ralsei transforms from a flower into a goat monster? and this time the plan succeeds, restoring balance between light and dark. And then he loses his power and turns back into a flower. Flowey and Ralsei hold opposite narrative positions in their respective stories, so their failure and success are also reversed, yet both end up returning to being a flower. It's kind of ironic. But speaking of narrative positions, Flowey is a villain for most of the story, and only gets redeemed at the very end of the pacifist route. So, if Undertale's pacifist route corresponds to Deltarune's weird route, could that mean Ralsei becomes the final boss of the weird route? Many theorists believe that the weird route moves closer to fulfilling the prophecy. So could the final prophecy be that Ralsei becomes the final boss, and the protagonists have to fight him? I've always been very bothered by what Susie says to Ralsei after the Gerson statue fight. We're doing it together, as a team, and nothing's gonna change that. That line feels like a flag to me. What if the final prophecy is that Ralsei absorbs all the overflowing darkness, and we must defeat or purify Ralsei to restore balance between light and dark? That would explain why Susie becomes furious, because in the very end, she's being told she has to fight her closest friend. She would find that prophecy ridiculous and refuse to let it happen. Why not sacrifice the other heroes, like some theorists suggest? Because after Susie sees the final prophecy, Ralsei says, "I'm sorry I didn't say the whole prophecy at first." Let me ask you this, if from the very start, someone told you, "Hey, you should become a hero, but you'll be sacrificed in the end," would anyone agree to that? Of course not. So, if telling the truth from the beginning was an option, then it definitely wouldn't be the first or second hero being sacrificed. But if the sacrifice was clearly stated from the start, and it wasn't yourself, then maybe someone would accept it. This also explains why Ralsei always believes he isn't important and shouldn't have personal desires, because he knows that in the end, he's meant to be sacrificed. And Ralsei's name ending also rhymes with the final prophecy. Ralsei is pronounced Ralsei, not Ralsei. This is hinted at in a small Chapter 2 gag, where Susie misspells his name as Ralsei. When editing the rulebook, she spelled it wrong because it sounds the same. So, would the prophecy really state Ralsei's name that directly? Well, Jockington grows the beard already sets a precedent for extremely literal prophecy wording. So I believe Ralsei is very likely the tragedy described in the final prophecy. Below is the version of the prophecy that ChatGPT helped me reconstruct after I shared this idea. The last prophecy, the story's end, and then, when all hope is lost for the tale, the final tragedy unveils. To save the worlds, there is only one way. One must slay Ralsei. Only then will the worlds be saved. And that concludes my theory that Deltarune is the inverse of Undertale, along with my predictions for the future story. If you have any thoughts, feel free to leave a comment. I'm Fax. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.